The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched across several miles, its crystal walls pulsing with soft blue light that came from the Vorthak homeworld. Representatives from 12 powerful species sat in their designated areas, each group displaying the wealth and might of their civilizations. The air hummed with translation devices that converted thousands of different languages into understandable thoughts and sounds. Commander Thex of the Draknari stepped forward to address the assembly. His obsidian scales caught the light as he moved, each one sharp enough to cut through metal. His burning red eyes swept across the gathered representatives as he began his report. The Draknari had just finished conquering the Flowing Ones, a peaceful species that lived in the deep oceans of 12 different worlds. These creatures had made the mistake of refusing to allow mining operations in their sacred waters. Thex spoke, with pride about how quickly the resistance had crumbled. The Draknari had simply boiled the oceans on 3 worlds, forcing the Flowing Ones to watch their children die in the heated waters. After that demonstration, the remaining 9 worlds surrendered without firing a single shot. The Flowing Ones now worked as slaves in underwater mining facilities, extracting precious minerals for the Draknari war machine. High Arbiter Kess of the Vorthak rose next, her crystalline body casting rainbow patterns across the floor. The Vorthak were masters of the mind, able to reach into the thoughts of other beings and twist them like clay. She reported on the recent pacification of rebels on the Rim worlds, where several species had attempted to form an alliance against Council rule. The rebellion had lasted 3 years before Kess and her team arrived. Within 6 months, every rebel leader was converted into a loyal servant of the Council. The Vorthak had not needed to fire weapons or destroy cities. They simply entered the minds of the resistance fighters and changed their thoughts. Now those same rebels worked enthusiastically to hunt down any remaining dissidents. Engineer Prime Cal of the Zephyrians floated above his delegation, his gaseous form shifting between different colors as he spoke. The Zephyrians controlled air, an atmosphere able to make any world uninhabitable or perfect for life as they chose. His latest achievement was the conquest of the Skyriders, a species that lived in floating cities high above. Their gas giant homeworld. The Skyriders had believed their aerial cities made them safe from ground attacks. They learned otherwise when the Zephyrians turned their own atmosphere against them. Toxic clouds rolled through the floating cities, and hurricane winds tore their structures apart. The survivors begged for mercy within days. Their cities now served as atmospheric processing stations for the Zephyrian Empire. Each species in the Council had perfected their own methods of breaking others. The Draknari used fear and overwhelming force. They would arrive at a world with massive fleets, destroy a few cities, and demand surrender. Most species gave up immediately rather than face total destruction. The Vorthak preferred psychological warfare, finding the mental weaknesses of their targets and exploiting them until resistance became impossible. The Zephyrians made worlds uninhabitable, forcing species to choose between death and slavery. Other council members had their own specialties. The Klaxon used sonic weapons that could shatter bones from orbit. The Mordek employed biological weapons that targeted specific genetic markers. The Yulari manipulated gravity fields to crush entire cities, but all their methods shared one common element. They identified what each species valued most, then threatened to destroy it completely. Some species valued their children above all else, so the Council would target the young first. Others prized their art and culture, which could be erased forever. Many species depended on specific environments or foods, making them vulnerable to ecological warfare. The pattern was always the same. The Council would study a species for months or years, learning their weaknesses and psychology. Then they would design a campaign that would break the target species as quickly and efficiently as possible. It had worked for 300 years across more than 200 different conquests. Navigator Primekel of the Vorthak interrupted the celebration with new information. Her scouts had discovered another species on the edge of known space. They lived on the 3rd planet of a yellow star, in a system that showed signs of recent technological development. Initial scans suggested these beings called themselves humans. The preliminary data looked promising. The humans appeared to be relatively primitive, having only recently achieved spaceflight. Their world was divided into numerous competing nations that regularly fought each other over resources and territory. They had not yet developed faster-than-light travel or energy weapons. By all standard measurements, they should be easy targets for the next phase of Council expansion. Kel displayed holographic images of the human homeworld. It was a blue and green planet with large oceans and diverse climates. The humans had built cities across all the continents and had begun establishing small colonies on nearby worlds. Their technology seemed to be advancing rapidly, but it was still centuries behind Council standards. The most encouraging sign was their tendency toward internal conflict. Human nations spent enormous resources fighting each other instead of working together. They had recently concluded a massive global war that had devastated their civilization. Yet they continued to maintain large military forces aimed at each other rather than external threats. Commander Thex smiled, showing rows of razor-sharp teeth. A divided species was always easier to conquer. A council could play different human nations against each other, offering advanced technology to some while destroying others. Within a few years, the humans would be begging to join the council. As junior members, High Arbiter Kess agreed that the humans showed promise as targets. Their minds appeared to be relatively simple compared to more advanced species. Preliminary psychic scans suggested they had no natural defenses against mental manipulation. A few well-placed suggestions to their leaders should be enough to turn their own governments against their people. Engineer Prime Cal noted that the human atmosphere was perfect for Zephyrian manipulation. A few small changes to their weather patterns would create droughts, floods, and storms that would cripple their primitive agriculture. Faced with starvation, the humans would have no choice but to accept council terms. The council voted unanimously to begin standard assessment procedures. Scout fleets would be dispatched to observe human behavior and identify weaknesses. Within one standard year, they expected to begin active conquest operations. The humans would become the 201st species to join the Galactic Council. Whether they wanted to or not. As the assembly prepared to adjourn, the representatives shared quiet satisfaction. Another species had been identified for conquest, and another world would soon bow to their combined might. They had never failed before, and they saw no reason why these humans should be any different from all the others who had fallen before them. Scout Captain Rox guided his fleet through the asteroid belt of the human solar system, maintaining a safe distance from the third planet while deploying surveillance drones. The Drachnari had perfected the art of observation over centuries of conquest, and Rox was one of their best scouts. His mission was simple: watch the humans for several months, identify their weaknesses, and report back to the council with a complete assessment. The first reports confused him. The humans were indeed primitive by galactic standards, using chemical rockets instead of gravity drives and metal projectiles instead of energy weapons. Their cities were sprawling and inefficient, their governments constantly argued with each other, and they seemed to spend more time fighting themselves than advancing their technology. Everything suggested they would be easy targets, but something felt wrong. Rox had observed dozens of species before conquest, and most showed clear patterns of behavior when faced with external pressure. They either unified against the threat or fragmented completely. The humans did neither. They continued their internal disputes while simultaneously preparing for something they could not yet see. Engineer Prime Cal arrived with the first Zephyrian test ships, ready to begin environmental manipulation. This was always the safest way to gauge a species' response to pressure. Zephyrians would create a few natural disasters, nothing too obvious, and observe how the target species reacted to stress. They started with small changes. A hurricane here, a drought there, some unusual temperature variations that could easily be explained as natural phenomena. The Zephyrians expected the humans to panic, blame each other, and begin fighting over resources as their primitive agriculture failed. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The humans began working together. When the hurricane struck the eastern coast of their largest continent, human governments from around the world sent aid without being asked. Ships arrived carrying food, medical supplies, and rescue equipment from nations that had been enemies just months before. The humans treated the disaster as a shared problem rather than an opportunity to gain advantage over their rivals. The drought in their southern regions produced similar results. Instead of fighting over water resources, the humans began massive engineering projects to move water from areas that had plenty to places that needed it. They shared technology freely, pooled their resources, and worked day and night to solve problems that should have crippled their civilization. Most disturbing of all, the humans seemed to enjoy the challenge. Their communication networks buzzed with excitement about new solutions and innovations. They celebrated successful rescue operations like military victories and treated each solved problem as proof they could handle anything. High Arbiter Kest decided to test human mental defenses before the situation became more complicated. Psionic Adept Vel, one of the most skilled mind controllers in the Vorthak fleet, attempted to influence key human leaders. The plan was simple: plant suggestions that would increase conflict between human nations and make them more vulnerable. To direct conquest, Vel chose his targets carefully. The leaders of the largest human nations should be easy to manipulate, their minds filled with ambition and fear that could be twisted to serve council purposes. He reached out with his psychic abilities, expecting to find the simple thought patterns typical of primitive species. Instead, he encountered something that made no sense. Human minds were chaos. Their thoughts jumped randomly between subjects, mixing memories with imagination in ways that defied all logic. When Vel tried to plant a suggestion, it would bounce around inside their minds, changing and evolving until it became something completely different. Worse, the humans seemed to have natural defenses they did not even know about. Their chaotic thinking patterns created a kind of mental static that confused Vorthak abilities. When Vel tried to read their thoughts, he found himself lost in streams of consciousness that included everything, from childhood memories to plans for fictional stories to random songs that played endlessly in their heads. After several failed attempts, Vel reported something the Vorthak had never encountered. Humans were accidentally immune to mind control. Their thoughts were too disorganized and unpredictable for standard psychic manipulation to work effectively. Commander Thex grew impatient with subtlety. The Draknari preferred direct action, and months of failed soft tactics convinced him that humans needed to see overwhelming force before they would surrender. He began moving his battle fleet to the edge of human space, allowing their sensors to detect Draknari ships. Fear was the Draknari's most effective weapon. When other species saw the massive dark ships bristling with weapons, they typically began surrender negotiations immediately. The sight of a Draknari battlecruiser had ended wars before they started and toppled governments overnight. Human reaction was completely wrong. Instead of terror, their communication networks exploded with excitement. Scientists wanted to study alien technology. Military leaders began calculating battle strategies. Politicians argued about first contact protocols while engineers started modifying their weapons and ships for combat against an unknown enemy. Most disturbing was the tone of human communications. They seemed thrilled by the prospect of fighting an advanced alien species. Messages intercepted by Draknari intelligence included phrases like, "Finally," "a real challenge," and "time to show what humans can do, and this is going to be amazing." The council representatives met again to discuss these troubling developments. Every standard tactic had failed to produce expected results. Environmental pressure made humans cooperate instead of fighting each other. Psychological warfare was ineffective against their chaotic minds. The display of superior force excited them rather than terrifying them. Navigator Prime Kel suggested they might be dealing with a species that had unusual cultural values. Perhaps humans were naturally aggressive and saw the council ships as a welcome opportunity for combat. Some species were known to be warrior cultures that preferred fighting to negotiation, but even warrior species had limits. They would fight bravely, but eventually they would recognize superior force and surrender to save their people. The humans showed no signs of realistic assessment of their chances. They continued preparing for war as if they believed they could actually win against technology centuries ahead of their own. Scout Captain Rocks reported increased human activity throughout their solar system. They were building defenses around their homeworld, fortifying their small colonies, and converting civilian ships into military vessels. Most strangely, they were broadcasting messages into space that seemed to be directed at the Council fleet. The messages were not pleas for mercy or offers to negotiate. Instead, they were challenges. Humans were actually taunting the most powerful military force in the galaxy, daring them to attack and promising to make them regret it. They spoke of their own military history with pride, describing ancient battles where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through determination and clever tactics. Some messages included what humans called war songs, musical pieces that seemed designed to boost fighting spirit and intimidate enemies. The lyrics spoke of death before dishonor, victory against impossible odds, and the glory of dying in battle for something greater than oneself. The Council faced a dilemma they had never encountered before. Standard conquest procedures were not working against this species. The humans refused to respond appropriately to any form of pressure or intimidation. They seemed determined to fight regardless of the odds against them. Commander Vex advocated for immediate, overwhelming assault. If the humans wanted a fight, the Drachneri would give them one that would end quickly and serve as an example to the rest of the galaxy. Fear was still their most effective weapon, and the complete destruction of human resistance would demonstrate Council power to any other species. Considering rebellion, High Arbiter Kess suggested more time for psychological analysis. Perhaps there was some aspect of human culture they had missed, some key to their mental defenses that could be exploited. Given enough study, the Vorthek could find a way to turn human minds against themselves. Engineer Prime Cal supported immediate action but preferred environmental warfare. If the Zephyrians made Earth completely uninhabitable, the humans would be forced to surrender or die. Even the most stubborn species had to breathe. The Council voted to begin active conquest operations. 3 species working together had never failed to break a target civilization. The humans would learn that their enthusiasm for fighting was no match for superior technology and centuries of military experience. The combined Council fleet approached Earth like a dark storm cloud, hundreds of ships forming precise battle formations that had conquered countless worlds. Commander Vex stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching tactical displays that showed the pitiful human defenses. A few dozen primitive vessels and some orbital platforms armed with chemical weapons stood between Earth and galactic conquest. The battle plan was simple and had worked for 3 centuries. The Drachneri would demonstrate overwhelming firepower by destroying the outer defenses. The Vorthak would broadcast psychic terror waves to break human morale. The Zephyrians would begin atmospheric poisoning to make resistance impossible. Most species surrendered within hours of such an assault. The first engagement began near the human outer colonies. Council ships expected to sweep aside the small defensive fleets in minutes. Instead, the battle stretched into hours as human vessels fought with impossible determination. When their weapon systems failed, human crews rigged emergency repairs that should not have worked. When their ships were crippled, they used them as missiles to ram Council vessels. Commander Vex watched in disbelief as a human destroyer, its hull torn open and engines dead, somehow managed to fire one final torpedo that punched through his battlecruiser's shields. The explosion killed 12 Drachneri warriors and damaged critical systems. No primitive species had ever drawn blood from a Drachneri flagship before. The humans fought like no enemy the Council had ever faced. They adapted their tactics constantly, learning from each engagement and sharing information instantly across their entire fleet. When Council ships used energy weapons, the humans developed reflective armor plating overnight. When the Drachneri employed boarding tactics, human defenders used their own ship's atmosphere as a weapon, venting air to create explosive decompression that killed attackers. Most disturbing was human morale. Every other species became demoralized when casualties mounted. Humans seemed to grow more determined with each loss. Their communication channels filled with messages of encouragement, tactical updates, and something the translators could only render as battle joy. They were actually enjoying the fight. High Arbiter Kess attempted to break human resistance through psychological warfare. The Vorthak broadcasted images of their previous conquests, showing the fate of species that had dared to resist council power. Entire civilizations reduced to slavery, worlds stripped of resources, populations working themselves to death in council mines and factories. The human response shocked her. Instead of terror, the broadcast seemed to make them angry. Human communication. Networks exploded with rage about what the council had done to other species. They began broadcasting their own messages, promising to free every enslaved world and make the council pay for centuries of oppression. Some humans recorded personal messages to the council, describing in graphic detail what they planned to do to any alien invaders they captured. Others shared stories from their military history, describing battles where human forces had fought impossible odds and won through determination and sacrifice. They sang their war songs louder and spoke of honor and duty in ways that seemed to actually boost their fighting effectiveness. Engineer Prime Cal began atmospheric poisoning operations, releasing toxins that would make Earth uninhabitable within weeks. This tactic had never failed. When faced with the choice between surrender and watching their world die, every species had chosen submission. The humans would surely see reason when their children began dying, but the humans had prepared for this possibility. They began massive evacuation operations, moving populations into underground cities and orbital habitats they had built with impossible speed. Some humans even ventured onto the poisoned surface in protective suits to conduct guerrilla operations against Council ground forces. The evacuation revealed another disturbing aspect of human psychology. They did not just save themselves. Human evacuation ships rescued animals, preserved art and culture, and even saved plants and soil samples to rebuild their world later. They treated the preservation of life as more important than military victory. Yet somehow this made them fight harder rather than weakening their resolve. After 3 months of fighting, Scout Captain Rox sent reports that would have been impossible to believe from any other observer. The human fleet, despite suffering enormous casualties, was actually growing stronger. They had captured several council ships, reverse-engineered the technology, and begun upgrading their own vessels with hybrid systems that combined primitive human engineering with advanced galactic technology. The humans had also begun counterattacking. They sent boarding parties against council ships using tactics no civilized species would consider. Human soldiers fought with modified weapons that should not have been effective against advanced armor. But they had studied captured equipment and found weaknesses that council engineers had never considered. Most shocking of all, human boarding parties seemed to take losses personally. When a human soldier died, his companions would fight with increased fury, as if each death made them more dangerous rather than weaker. They carved messages into council ship hulls, painted human symbols in their own blood, and left recordings promising revenge for their fallen friends. The humans had also begun disrupting council supply lines. Their small ships appeared throughout the outer system, attacking cargo vessels and communication relays with hit-and-run tactics that made no strategic sense but somehow worked. They seemed to understand that the council fleet was far from home and dependent on regular supply runs. Commander Vex requested reinforcements, something he had never needed before. The Draknari pride was wounded by human resistance, and he wanted enough ships to crush Earth through sheer overwhelming force. But the Council was facing another crisis that no one had anticipated. Other species throughout the galaxy had somehow learned about the human resistance. Encrypted human communications were spreading through the galactic network, carrying messages of hope and defiance that sparked rebellions on dozens of worlds. Species that had been under Council control for generations suddenly remembered what freedom meant. The humans were teaching other species how to resist. Their technical innovations were shared freely with anyone willing to fight the Council. Their tactical manuals were translated into hundreds of languages. Their war songs became anthems of rebellion that spread faster than Council forces could suppress them on the rim worlds. Vorthak mind control began failing as subjugated species. Learn the human mental defense techniques. Former slaves began thinking chaotic thoughts on purpose, making themselves immune to psychic manipulation. They painted human symbols on their faces and sang human songs while attacking their overseers. Hi, Arbitakes reported something unprecedented in Vorthak history. Their ability to control minds was weakening as more species learned human resistance. Techniques. The chaotic thinking patterns that made humans immune to mental manipulation could apparently be taught to others. Centuries of carefully maintained psychological control were crumbling as rebellion spread. Engineer Prime Cal faced his own crisis. Humans had begun terraforming operations on worlds the Zephyrians had made uninhabitable during previous conquests. They were not just adapting to hostile environments. They were actively healing damaged worlds using techniques that combined their primitive technology with captured Council equipment in ways that violated everything the Zephyrians understood about atmospheric science. The Council realized they faced something they had never encountered before, a species that refused to break. Worse, the humans were breaking others out of Council control. Every day of continued fighting weakened Council authority while strengthening the growing rebellion. Commander Thex convened an emergency meeting of field commanders. For the first time in Draknari history, they were considering retreat. The humans had cost them more ships and warriors in 3 months than they had lost in the previous century of conquest. Their tactics made no sense, their determination was inhuman, and their influence was spreading throughout the galaxy like a disease. The meeting lasted for hours as Council representatives struggled with concepts they had never needed to consider. Negotiation, compromise, withdrawal, these were words that existed in their languages but had no practical meaning in their experience. The humans had forced them to consider the unthinkable. What if conquest was not always possible? What if some species simply could not be broken? And most terrifying of all, what if the humans were right about freedom being worth any price? The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the same great hall where they had planned human conquest 6 months earlier. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Instead of confident rulers discussing their next victory, the representatives gathered as beings facing their first true defeat. The blue light from the Vorthak crystals seemed dimmer, and the translation devices carried undertones of uncertainty that had never existed before. Commander Thex delivered his report with visible frustration. The Draknari had always been masters of warfare, their tactics proven across countless battlefields. But human resistance had evolved beyond anything in their experience. Every week brought new innovations as humans modified captured Council technology in ways that should not have been possible. Human boarding parties now carried weapons that combined primitive human engineering with Draknari energy systems. These hybrid devices were crude and unstable, but they worked. Worse, human soldiers seemed to treat equipment failure as a challenge rather than a problem. When their weapons broke down during combat, they would repair them with spare parts torn from their own ships or even use the broken pieces as melee weapons. The most disturbing development was how humans responded to individual losses. When a human soldier died, his companions would study exactly how it happened and develop new tactics to prevent similar deaths. They treated each casualty as a learning experience and shared that knowledge instantly across their entire military force. The Draknari were facing an enemy that grew smarter and more dangerous every time they inflicted casualties. Human counterattacks had become increasingly bold. They had begun targeting Draknari command ships, using suicide missions that should have been militarily pointless but somehow achieved strategic goals. A single human pilot would sacrifice himself to destroy a ship containing hundreds of Draknari officers, and rather than demoralizing human forces, these actions seemed to inspire them to greater efforts. High Arbiter Cass spoke next, her crystalline form flickering with patterns that indicated deep distress. The Vorthak had built their empire on psychological control, their ability to reach into minds and reshape thoughts according to their will. But human mental defenses were not just holding firm. They were actually getting stronger. The humans had somehow learned to weaponize their chaotic thought patterns. Instead of simply resisting Vorthak mental intrusion, some humans had begun projecting their mental chaos outward. Vorthak operatives attempting psychic attacks found themselves overwhelmed by streams of random, human thoughts that included everything from mathematical equations to childhood songs to detailed plans for impossible inventions. Even more troubling, other species were learning these techniques. The humans had begun broadcasting something they called mental defense training throughout the galaxy. Enslaved populations were teaching each other to think like humans, filling their minds with contradictory ideas and emotional chaos that made Vorthak control impossible. On dozens of worlds, centuries of careful psychological conditioning were crumbling as former slaves embraced human concepts of individual freedom and self-determination. They stopped following orders, began making their own decisions, and worst of all, started believing they had the right to resist their masters. Engineer Prime Cal's report was equally disturbing. The Zephyrians had always controlled environments and atmospheres, making life impossible for species that refused to surrender. But humans were treating hostile environments as problems to solve rather than reasons to give up. On worlds where the Zephyrians had poisoned the atmosphere, humans were building enclosed cities and developing new life support technologies. They were not just surviving in conditions that should have killed them. They were finding ways to reverse the damage. Human terraforming operations had begun on 3 worlds the Council had rendered uninhabitable, and early results suggested they might actually succeed in making those worlds livable again. The humans were also sharing their environmental technologies with liberated species. Former slave populations were using human techniques to clean up worlds damaged by centuries of resource extraction. They were replanting forests, purifying water supplies, and rebuilding ecosystems that the Council had destroyed for industrial purposes. Navigator Prime Kel delivered the most shocking news. Long-range scouts reported that the rebellion was spreading faster than Council forces could respond. 17 star systems had declared independence from Council rule, and more were joining the uprising every day. Human communication networks had somehow penetrated deep into Council territory, carrying messages of hope and resistance that sparked revolts across the galaxy. The rebels were not just fighting for their own freedom. They were coordinating with each other, sharing resources and tactical information in ways that reminded Council observers of human behavior. Species that had been enemies for centuries were working together against their common oppressors, united by human concepts of universal rights and self-governance. Most disturbing of all, the rebels were winning. They had captured entire Council fleets, liberated dozens of slave worlds, and established free zones where Council authority no longer existed. The rigid hierarchy that had controlled the galaxy for 3 centuries was collapsing as more species chose freedom over security. The Council faced a crisis they had never imagined possible. Their empire was crumbling from within as the very species they had conquered turned against them. The humans had not just resisted conquest. They had shown others that resistance was possible. Commander Thex suggested total warfare as a solution. If the Drachnari deployed their entire fleet and destroyed every rebellious world completely, the uprising might be contained. Fear had always been their most effective weapon, and the complete annihilation of several star systems would demonstrate the price of defying Council authority. But High Arbiter Kess pointed out a crucial problem. The humans had captured enough Council technology to build their own fleets. Total warfare might destroy the rebels, but it would also devastate the Council fleets and leave the galaxy in ruins. Even if they won, there would be nothing left to rule. Engineer Prime Cal suggested environmental warfare on a galactic scale. The Zephyrians could poison entire star systems, making them uninhabitable for any form of life. But this approach faced the same problem as military annihilation. Destroying everything they had built over 3 centuries would be a victory worse than defeat. The debate continued for hours as Council representatives struggled with concepts their civilization had never needed to consider: compromise, negotiation, peaceful coexistence. These ideas existed in their historical records from the time before their empire, but no living council member had ever practiced them. Navigator Prime Kel asked the question that no one wanted to face directly. What if they simply could not defeat the humans? Every tactic had failed, every strategy had backfired, and the rebellion was growing stronger every day. Perhaps it was time to consider alternatives to conquest. The suggestion sent shockwaves through the assembly. The Galactic Council had never negotiated with conquered species before. They dictated terms from a position of absolute power, and inferior civilizations accepted those terms or faced destruction. The idea of treating humans as equals was almost inconceivable, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. The humans had proven they could not be broken through force, intimidation, or environmental pressure. They had turned council tactics against their creators and inspired galaxy-wide rebellion. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that the council empire was not invincible. Commander Thex argued that negotiation would be seen as weakness. If the council appeared vulnerable, every species in the galaxy would rebel against their rule. The empire would collapse overnight, leaving chaos and warfare throughout known space. High Arbiter Kess suggested that chaos might be preferable to the current situation. The uprising was already spreading beyond council control, and continuing the war would only make it worse. Perhaps it was time to consider what the humans actually wanted instead of trying to force them into submission. The question revealed another problem the council had never faced. They had spent months trying to conquer humanity, but they had never bothered to learn what humans were fighting for. All previous enemies had wanted survival, resources, or territory. What did humans want that made them willing to die rather than surrender? Engineer Prime Cal accessed human communications and presented translations of their demands. The humans wanted complete withdrawal of council forces from Earth and all other occupied worlds. They demanded the establishment of a galactic federation based on voluntary membership rather than conquest. They insisted on reparations for damaged worlds and technological sharing to help liberated species defend themselves. Most shocking of all, the humans were not interested in ruling the galaxy themselves. They wanted every species to govern itself, according to its own values and traditions. They spoke of cooperation between equals rather than domination by the strong. The council representatives sat in stunned silence as they processed this information. The humans were offering something that had never existed in galactic history, a government based on consent rather than force. It was an idea so revolutionary that most council members could barely understand it. The session ended without resolution, but a consensus was emerging. The traditional methods of conquest had failed completely. The rebellion was growing stronger every day, and total warfare would destroy everything they had built. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Galactic Council faced the possibility that they might need to negotiate rather than dictate. The question was whether they could learn to coexist with species they had always seen as inferior, and whether the humans would be willing to accept anything less than complete freedom for every enslaved world in the galaxy. The message arrived through standard diplomatic channels, but its content was unprecedented in galactic history. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Galactic Council was requesting a ceasefire. Commander Thex stared at the transmission orders with visible disbelief, his burning red eyes reflecting the humiliation of his entire species. The mighty Drachneri, conquerors of 200 worlds, were asking humans for peace talks. The human response came within hours, transmitted on all frequencies so that every species in the galaxy could hear it. Ambassador Ray Thompson speaking. For the newly formed Human Federation agreed to consider a ceasefire under specific conditions. The talks would take place on neutral ground, all species would be represented equally, and the agenda would include complete restructuring of galactic governance. The negotiations were set for a space station in the boundary region between human space and council territory. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, built by humans and liberated species working together. Its design combined technologies from dozens of different civilizations, creating something that represented the diversity and unity the humans claimed to value. Commander Thex arrived with the largest Drachnari delegation ever assembled for diplomatic purposes. He expected to find primitive humans awed by the presence of their galactic superiors, ready to negotiate favorable terms for their surrender. Instead, he met beings who had spent months preparing for this moment with the same intensity they brought to warfare. Ambassador Thompson led the human delegation, flanked by military strategists who had studied every council battle for the past 6 months, diplomats who had learned the customs and psychology of dozens of species, and scientists who had reverse-engineered council technology to understand exactly how advanced their former enemies truly were. The humans presented their terms with the same confidence they had shown throughout the war. They demanded complete withdrawal of all council forces from Earth and every other occupied world. They insisted on the liberation of all enslaved species and the dissolution of the council's imperial government. They wanted reparations for the environmental damage done to Earth and technological sharing to help freed species defend themselves. High Arbiter Kess attempted to negotiate from a position of strength, pointing out that the Council still controlled most of the galaxy and possessed superior technology. The humans could achieve a favorable peace by accepting junior membership in the Council hierarchy, gaining protection and advanced technology in exchange for acknowledging Council authority. Ambassador Thompson's response revealed how completely the humans had studied their opponents. He presented detailed intelligence reports showing the true extent of the Galactic Rebellion. 47 star systems had declared independence, Council supply lines were cut across 3 galactic sectors, and Imperial authority was collapsing faster than Council forces could respond. The humans had not been fighting alone. They had been coordinating with resistance movements throughout Council space, sharing technology and tactical knowledge that enabled successful revolts on dozens of worlds. The war was not just about Earth's freedom. It had become a galaxy-wide struggle for self-determination. Engineer Prime Cal suggested a compromise position. Perhaps the Council could maintain authority over core worlds while granting autonomy to outer systems. The Zephyrians would cease atmospheric manipulation operations in exchange for guaranteed access to strategic resources from liberated worlds. The human response demonstrated their complete rejection of imperial thinking. Ambassador Thompson explained that freedom was not negotiable. Every species had the right to govern itself according to its own values and traditions. No species had the right to rule others through force or intimidation. These principles were absolute and applied equally to all civilizations. The humans also revealed their long-term vision for galactic governance. They proposed a voluntary federation where species could choose their level of participation in shared institutions, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and cooperative research programs would be negotiated between equals rather than imposed by imperial decree. Navigator Prime Cal asked the question that had haunted Council members since the war began. What would happen if they refused these terms? The galaxy was already in rebellion, Council authority was crumbling, and continued warfare would only accelerate the collapse of their empire. Ambassador Thompson's answer changed the fundamental dynamic of the negotiations. The humans would continue fighting until every enslaved species was free, regardless of the cost to themselves or the galaxy. They would rather see civilization collapse than allow imperial oppression to continue. More importantly, they had convinced hundreds of other species to embrace the same philosophy. The breakthrough came when High Arbiter Kess asked a simple question about human motivations. Why were they willing to sacrifice themselves for species they had never met? What did humans gain from freeing distant worlds that had no strategic value to Earth? Ambassador Thompson's explanation revealed the core of human philosophy that had confused Council members throughout the war. Humans believed that freedom was not something to be earned or granted. It was a fundamental right that belonged to every sentient being in the universe. Fighting for others was not sacrifice. It was moral obligation. The concept was revolutionary in a galaxy that had operated on principles of conquest and domination for millennia. Most species fought for survival, territory, or resources. Humans fought for ideas that had no physical value but somehow motivated them to impossible efforts. The negotiations continued for weeks as council representatives struggled to understand concepts that contradicted everything they believed about power and governance. The humans remained patient but firm, willing to explain their philosophy repeatedly but unwilling to compromise on fundamental principles. Slowly, individual council members began to see possibilities they had never considered. Commander Thex realized that cooperation might be more efficient than conquest. Worlds that joined the Federation voluntarily would contribute resources and knowledge freely rather than under compulsion. The Draknari could become respected allies rather than feared oppressors. High Arbiter Kess discovered that willing minds shared more information than controlled ones. The Vorthak could develop their psychic abilities through cooperation with other telepathic species rather than parasitic domination. Mental diversity might actually strengthen their civilization rather than threatening it. Engineer Prime Cal found that helping species restore damaged worlds was more satisfying than making them uninhabitable. The Zephyrians could become galactic environmental engineers, using their abilities to create paradise worlds rather than weapons of mass destruction. The final agreement established the Galactic Federation with Earth as the administrative center and humans serving as the primary peacekeeping force. Former council species were granted full membership as equals, but their imperial privileges were permanently revoked. Every world in the galaxy would choose its own government and level of participation in federal institutions. The transformation was not immediate or easy. Centuries of imperial conditioning took years to overcome, and some council hardliners attempted to restore the old system through military coups. But human peacekeepers, supported by troops from liberated worlds, maintained order while former enemies learned to cooperate. The new galactic capital on Earth became a symbol of the revolution in thinking that humans had brought to the galaxy. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered in council chambers where decisions were made through debate and consensus rather than imperial decree. The diversity was stunning. Crystalline Vorthak working alongside gaseous Zephyrians, reptilian, Draknari sharing research with aquatic former slaves. Trade flourished between worlds that had been cut off from each other for centuries. Scientific cooperation accelerated technological development at rates the old empire had never achieved. Cultural exchange programs allowed species to learn from each other's arts, philosophies, and traditions. Most importantly, the galaxy was at peace. Not the enforced quiet of imperial oppression, but the genuine cooperation of free peoples working together toward common goals. Wars still occurred occasionally, but the Federation's mediation services and peacekeeping forces prevented most conflicts from escalating beyond local disputes. In the final scene, a young human child visited the Galactic Museum on Earth, walking past exhibits that displayed artifacts from hundreds of different civilizations. She stopped before a memorial wall listing the species that had been enslaved by the old council, reading names in dozens of different languages and writing systems. Her grandmother found her there, studying the memorial with the serious expression children wore when trying to understand complex adult concepts. The child asked why the galactic species had given up their empire and chosen to live as equals instead of rulers. The grandmother smiled as she explained the lesson that had taken the galaxy centuries to learn. Humans had shown everyone that freedom was not something you took from others. It was something you shared with them. The more freedom you gave away, the more you had yourself. And that truth had changed everything. The galaxy had learned that while every species breaks eventually under enough pressure, humans were different. They did not break others. They freed them. They did not conquer. They liberated. And in the end, that made all the difference between an empire built on fear and a federation built on hope.